Good afternoon to all. On behalf of the organizing committee and all the participants, Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Bhubaneswar, India, in association with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, and Central University of Odisha, Koraput. It's a great pleasure to welcome all the participants in this global digital platform, those who have already joined in this Zoom meetings and still joining us, and also all the viewers in the Facebook and YouTube to the World Human Sciences and Management Conference. The broader theme of this conference is Ethnological Contexts, Disciplinary Practices of Social Science and Policy Frames. And also the main aim of this conference is to discuss dialogue and development. I also thanks to the patrons of this conference, Professor Mahadev Jaswal, the director of the Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, and Professor I. Rama Brahma, Honorable Vice Chancellor of the Central University of Odisha, Koraput. And also I thanks to our convener of this conference, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, is the professor, eminent professor of history at Ravenshaw University, Cuttack, India, and futurist, Professor Charudatta Pranigai of India. And also I thanks to Professor Sarath Kumar Palita, the professor and dean of the Central University of Odisha, Koraput. So apart from that, just I want to mention here in this, for the last couple of meetings, the participants have been demanding the certificates. Definitely will provide the certificate to all the participants in this next meeting or in this very near future. And also, I also want to make clear to all the participants of the questions. Those who will ask the questions, they can ask question in the chat box, and also you can give the comment and feedback in the chat box. And this meeting will last up to 60 minutes from now. And Mr. Subham Das and Rudranaran Das will assist us. So before going to listen from Professor David Hirsh, I would like to Miss Sipra Khuntia to introduce about the our guest speaker, Professor David Hirsh. Over to Miss Sipra Khuntia. She will introduce about our guest speaker. Sipra, can you hear me? Sipra?
Yes.
Yes, you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of Indian people and all the participants of the Zoom meeting and viewers of Facebook and YouTube, it is my great honor to introduce Professor David Hirsh to the World Human Sciences and Management Conference. In terms of Professor Hirsch's brief background, he is currently the senior lecturer in sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London. Hirsch grew up in a Jewish family in Highgate, London, and attended Highgate School until he was 15 years old. He studied sociology at City University, London. He did an MA in philosophy and social theory at the University of Warwick. And he wrote his PhD there on crimes against humanity and international law. David has been in the sociology department at Goldsmiths, University of London since 2003. And in 2005, he co-founded the NTS website, a resource for those working to oppose the boycott of Israel. Hirsch took a leading role during 2005 to 7 in opposing boycotts of Israeli universities proposed by British academics. He was the holder of Sociological Review Fellowship, which enabled him to write Law Against Genocide, Cosmopolitan Trials. This book was awarded by the British Sociological Association and also received the award of Philip Abrahams Prize for the best first book in sociology 2004. His recent work, Contemporary Left Antisemitism, which was published by Routledge 2017, which combined narrative and case study with sociological analysis and theory to understand the controversial and contested phenomenon of anti-Semitism on the left. Again, it's a great pleasure, sir, and privilege to welcome Professor Hirsch to World Human Science and Management Conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sipra. Before going to heard from Professor David Hirsch. I would like to invite Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda and Professor Charudata Panigrai. They will give the introductory remarks on this topic for only 2 minutes each. Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda.
Yeah, good evening to everyone, to all the viewers. Thanks to everyone, the organizers, particularly Bikram and Samuel. And of course, a very warm welcome to David Hitz for agreeing to talk on a very interesting theme, which really engages a lot of reflections. So thank you very much, David, for trying to open up this rather contentious idea on how to think through this concept of anti-Semitism at a time like 21st century, and at a time when the whole talk of globalization is really a very powerful force for all of us to engage with. So, globalization at one end and anti-Semitism, the way they need to be engaged in conversation with, in contestation with, I think one of those dimensions that we need to be drawn to. And as you're fantastic, I mean, one of those very interesting book uh, that you have done recently, Contemporary Left and Anti-Semitism, the way it tries to address this issue is really challenging. And as when you say that anti-Semitism is not available to us as a conceptual resource only when it is dressed as a Nazi in a Nazi uniform. It's absolutely very interesting, and it's fascinating to look at this opening statement that paraphrases the kind of idea that encapsulates this book. And when you tries to look at this whole left tradition, of the way they have uh, framed their understanding of this world order and ideology, and the way they have looked at Israel and Jews, the question of Jews, and and accordingly they have framed their politics. It doesn't give them a kind of sort of liberty to exempt themselves of a kind of autocritic, kind of self-criticism that then one need to bring in. So one of those, I mean, as you have been rightly acclaimed as a scholar and activist, was taken up a very serious battle against fighting out a very predominant idea of the world that sums up your kind of, scholarship. I mean, one of those bravest and most thoughtful scholars, bravest and most thoughtful scholar activist. And in a way you are trying to develop a kind of, as it has been said, a kind of unanswerable case for anti-Semitism that is very provocative. And how do we do that, given the kind of episteme that we have been wedded to, that we need to have a very structured kind of understanding of anti-Semitism. But but at the same time, we remain oblivious of the fact that in our everyday existence, in our quotidian existence, we remain very much, people by those ideas. Our actions, our reflexes, our understanding, our ways of understanding, our ways of looking at things can smack of a lot of anti-Semitic activities. So this is a very salient point and a very strong premise on which you try to develop your arguments. So that is most fascinating aspect of your research into this question. And the last point that I would make before I close is that anti-Semitism can be available, as you rightly point out, that in the corridors of the left liberal politics, or in the trade union, the radical trade union conclaves, or in the radical left journals and social gatherings of the chattering classes, the seminars, in the reflections of the radical intellectuals. So it's not that it is something which is only somewhere forever clubbed as such or bracketed as such that this is anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism we can always encounter at every point of time, and this is where you try to bring in the politics of the left, and you see that how this could equally be dangerous, how left equally could be right, something like that. And in fact, a very unqualified and uncritical criticism of Israel can always build on to a series of anti-Semitism. And so what is the need of the hour is to, bring in a kind of paradigmatic shift to define what protocols could be involved to define anti-Semitism. And in fact, it's as your work tries to bring out that hostility to Israel can only be seen as a signifier of an identity that remains linked to opposition to imperialism, neoliberalism, global capitalism, and this is where the community of the good tries to look on. But looking on, they look on in a very dangerous way, in a very toxic manner, towards imaging and imagining and framing a kind of concept about the Jewish people, the Jewish society, and Israeli as a kind of ecology, and where you have to heap all kinds of evils of the world, something like that. So that's very interesting to talk about a democratic order, to talk about globalization, to talk about left-right ideological balance, and within, taking on from a particular, perspective of what you what can be defined intellectually as or conceptually as anti-Semitism is always challenging. A scholar with a disciplinary passion in terms of your orientation to sociology, or which is basically a kind of a discipline which remains at the front of in the front of social science domain, to understand global politics, to global the politics, the dynamics of global politics from a particular thematic aspect like this is always challenging. So thank you for agreeing to share your very valuable views to all of us at this point of time. And I think it's always a honor for any platform to be associated with a person of your stature, having to say something different, having to very boldly argue out a proposition against the so-called, a dominant in the world, dominated by what I can call the imperialism of categories, something like that. Thank you very much, David, for to be with us. And
thank you, Professor Nanda. Now, Professor Panigrai, give a 1 minute introductory remark, and then we'll go to David. Yes.
Thanks, Professor Lima. Thanks, David, for having given time on a Sunday morning. And this will be really an eye-opener, because many of us who would like to know more about anti-Semitism and the modern discipline of sociology in the current perspective and current context would actually understand the role of anti development or anti social cohesion kind of a perception that existed then could also be so much more relevant now. So having sociology and anti-Semitism being discussed this evening, this morning, would actually be one of our very innovative discussion platform that happens under this manner, which will be so helpful for students, for practitioners, for everyone who's attending this, or for everyone who would be listening to this the recording later on. So thanks, David, once again. And we know that modern anti-Semitism and modern discipline of sociology emerged almost in the same period. And sociology, where modernization was perceived as destroying unity or destroying social cohesion. That was a thought then. And anti-Semitism was response to almost an explanation or a response to society's deficiencies and crisis. We know about that, but what would be very interesting would be to understand 3 or 4 things pointedly. One, strong influence of Jewish writers and rising anti-Semitism in the formation of sociology. How did that happen? What were their thoughts then? And the role of anti-Semitism and historical development of sociology through its treatment by leading figures like Emily Durkheim or Talcott Parsons, or Theodore Adorno. And the third one, very important for all of us to learn from you, would be the discipline's development in the aftermath of the Holocaust. How did sociology develop? And did they go parallel, or did they cross their paths? So when we say that modern anti-Semitism and modern sociology were born together or almost traveled together, what was this travel like? What was this journey like? And it will be very interesting to know all of this from David. And we know that you're an accomplished scholar, accomplished writer, and an accomplished expressionist. So having said that, we'll be very happy to listen to you. And over to you, David, now.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen because I want to use PowerPoint. Let's hope that's possible. That works, yes?
Yes.
There we go. Firstly, I'd like to thank you very, very much for this invitation, which I'm very honoured by. And I'm particularly honoured by the 2 introductions that I just heard, which demonstrated a really serious wish to think about the topic that I'm going to talk about. And also, I'm always proud and always surprised when anybody reads my book. When people I don't know read my book, it's amazing to me. And they read it and understand it and get something from it, and every time it's a lovely thing. And I can tell from those 2 introductions that people have done exactly that. So thank you very, very much. And I will try through this lecture to answer some of the questions, and I hope there'll be time left over at the end to go into the questions more carefully that people want to ask. But also, I have a huge amount of material that I'm thinking about and that I want to try to cover. So let me press ahead, and excuse me if I will try to go quickly over things, because I just feel like I have a lot of material to cover. So the first thing I want to say, or the first proposition really perhaps, is simply the idea that conspiracy fantasy is often attractive. In a sense, the world looks like a conspiracy, right? It looks like a place where the powerful, be that white Europeans in the context of imperialism and colonialism, or be that the rich in the context of capitalism, or be that men in the context of feminism, the world looks as though the powerful are organized and they lie to everybody and they are violent to everybody and they have all the power through some kind of secret control. In other words, we look at the world and it's not obvious how it is that we have structures of power. And conspiracy fantasy is attractive. And it's just as attractive to people who look at the world and see injustice and they hate injustice and they feel themselves to be on the egalitarian left. Simple explanations are attractive, explanations which simplify the world and which give us an easy way of picturing who is responsible. And it seems to me that Marcel Stutzler makes this argument with great depth, actually. And the argument is that you can argue that sociology itself was constructed actually partly by Jews, by people like Emil Durkheim, and before there's sociologists, people like Marx, that these structural and scientific accounts of the world were intended to explain why the world looks like a conspiracy of a small number of powerful people, but it isn't. And so the structural scientific account of the world is a structural scientific account of power. And Marx, for example, I mean, it's amazing what Marx does, and it's so frustrating actually, because I teach some of the basics of Marx to first-year students every year. And what I tell them every time is I tell them what Marx does is he understands, firstly, that capitalism is hugely progressive and productive compared to what came before. And it's also hugely progressive in terms of the bringing the idea of the equality of human beings in terms of law, in terms of rights. And I go through Marx's quite complicated account of surplus value, and I explain how Marx says that equal and fair exchange of commodities for their correct price based on the labor theory of value results in a huge and increasing inequality. And excuse me, and this is not conspiracy, right? It's not a moral critique. The bourgeoisie is not mean and bad and nasty. It doesn't steal your money. It doesn't lie to you and fool you. What it does is it is part of a system of free and fair exchange of commodities at their correct price, which leads to inequality of power. So Marx offers you this kind of amazing argument, which shows you that out of equality comes inequality. And he shows you that it is not a conspiracy. And yet every year the students feed back to me essays which say, you know, the mean and nasty bourgeoisie steals everybody's money and keeps them down by force of arms. And so it's an interesting fact that Marx gives you an account of the world which undercuts conspiracy fantasy, but so many Marxists, and even my first years who come to Marx partly through me, so many Marxists actually come away with a view of the world which is fundamentally a conspiracy. So moving on to sociology. Funnily enough, this is some of the teaching I do also for my first year students. And it's a lovely course. Actually, it's called Critical Readings. And in fact, it reminds me a little of the work that I did with Gillian Rose, who was an astonishing philosopher and sociologist who taught me at master's level, who I'm very proud to have been taught with actually at the time that she was dying prematurely. And over the years, I've been teaching this kind of historical sweep, really, of Western thought, if you like. It begins with the Greeks, with Plato and Aristotle, and the Middle Ages, Aquinas and Machiavelli, and then even Shakespeare, and then goes into the kind of key liberal revolutionary democratic thinkers of the Enlightenment and of modernity. So, you know, Descartes comes along and says, anybody can create knowledge according to the rules of science. And Kant comes along and says, everybody can free themselves, can enlighten themselves and free themselves from old superstition. So you have the classical Enlightenment, liberal, democratic notion of the autonomous, rational subject, the human being who engages in politics and is part of a democratic society. And then comes along a whole number of social critiques of the Enlightenment notion of the autonomous rational subject. Even Rousseau with his account of the origins of inequality through property, and then Engels and Marx, and then into the sociologists proper, if you like, Kant and Durkheim and Weber, who say there is social structure, that we are not only agents, we're not only autonomous rational subjects, but we are also constructed by the world into which we are born. We are given language and understandings and manners and morals and ways of thinking. And we're given it by whom? We're given it by structure. And who creates structure? Well, human beings create structure. So there's this kind of interplay between agency and structure. But the social critique of the straightforward Enlightenment liberalism, the social critique says it would be great if we were all free to be autonomous rational subjects. But there are social structures which prevent us from fully becoming so. And then along comes, you know, Du Bois in America and says, well, there's racism, which exclude, you know, the history of slavery and racism excludes Black people in America from the ability to become rational autonomous subjects. And then Freud comes along and says, rational autonomous subject, he says, you don't even know what's really motivating you, because most of what motivates you is unconscious anyway. And then Hannah Arendt comes along and says that totalitarianism is the product of a kind of profound failure of rational subjectivity. And then Goffman says there is no rational subject at the heart of the person, but there's just different kinds of performativities. And Foucault says really what we're talking about is power. And Stuart Hall says that this is also about racism and multiculturalism and colonialism. So sociology and then the radical critiques which followed it are engagements with the Enlightenment philosophical tradition of the autonomous rational subject. And it seems to me very clear that there are two ways of moving on from there. One is to take Marx's position and say the task is to complete the Enlightenment. There are these social structures which get in the way of universal human rational autonomy. And the point is to attack those structures which get in the way and to recreate and complete the Enlightenment. And then the opposite view is the one that says the Enlightenment itself is, if you like, fake news. The Enlightenment itself pretends to be democratic and pretends to be liberal, but the rational autonomous subject is fundamentally a way of recreating those old power structures of domination. So if you like, sociology itself is a battle between these two souls. And it seems to me that very much sociology goes too far in the direction of structure. It says that structure prevents human beings from being agents. And liberalism goes too far towards agency. And it seems to me that that's one of the key ways of understanding our discipline. So just as an example, really, Emil Durkheim, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, writes the Rules of Sociological Method in 1895, and he sets out this idea, a radical idea, which is this idea that social life is real. The proposition which states that social facts must be treated as things. The proposition which is at the very basis of our method is among those which have stirred up the most opposition. People hated it. People hated the idea that we could study social life in a way analogous to that in which we study natural life. It was deemed paradoxical and scandalous for us to assimilate to the realities of the external world, those of the social world. People hated it, and they had a moral kind of horror. And Durkheim says this was singularly to misunderstand the meaning and effect of this assimilation, the object of which was not to reduce the higher forms of being to the level of the lower ones. In other words, not to reduce social life to physics and chemistry, but on the contrary, to claim for the former, to claim for social life a degree of reality at least equal to that which everyone accords to the latter, to physics and chemistry, and then biology. In other words, human beings are physical and they are chemical and they are biological, but what is really interesting about us is that we are social, and the social is not simply a product of the physical and chemical and biological. We do not say that social facts are material things, but that they are things just as are material things, although in a different way. So Durkheim is attempting to construct a scientific structural account of the world to show why it looks like a conspiracy but isn't. Now I'm going to move on to give you really, hopefully, an introduction to anti-Semitism. And part of the reason I want to do this is to explain to you why conspiracy fantasy, the fantasy that power structures are really created by a small conspiracy of bad people, is so close to anti-Semitism. There are, I think, three narratives, three parts, three forms of anti-Semitism. One is the blood libel. Begins with the Christian idea that the Jews rejected God. God came to save us all universally, but the Jews in their particularity said, no, we don't believe, we're not interested. And then, of course, in some narratives, and particularly some anti-Semitic narratives of Christianity, the Jews not only rejected God, but murdered God. So the murder of God is very important, and they show Jews to be irrational and evil. What is more evil than the murder of God? And this Christian anti-Semitism also shows us that the idea that the Jews are kind of central to everything bad in the world is very important. That Christianity comes along, and I want to be very clear, actually, that Christianity in itself, in my view, is not anti-Semitic, but there is a very long tradition of Christian anti-Semitism. So, of course, some Christians say that anti-Semitic Christianity is a misreading of Christianity, and others don't. But so this is not an essentialism, but the anti-Semitic history of Christianity is very important. So one of the reasons it's important is because, firstly, we, the good people, the Christians, the universal community, how do we define who we are? How do we perform who we are? We define who we are in relation to the Jews. The Jews actually gave us the Messiah, but they rejected him and murdered him. So we are good and the Jews are not good. So there's this ancient universalist Christian practice of defining ourselves, defining the community of the good in relation to Jews. And as I'll show you in a minute, blood libel resonates down the centuries in lots of different ways, but I'll come to that. The second narrative of anti-Semitism is Jewish power, that Jews are small in number, but they are powerful, they are globally significant. And part of this is through their ability to construct secret, powerful conspiracies in the anti-Semitic imagination. And part of it is about the inability of Jews to be loyal members of any other community. Jews are concerned about Jews globally, not about their own community. And however we define community, there is an anti-Semitism which defines Jews as not belonging. So if we define community as Christendom or Christianity, Jews do not belong because they reject and murder Christ. If we define community as the nation state, then Jews are the other of the nation, and Jews are not real French or British or Germans. And if we define anti-nationalism or socialism or communism as our community, if our community is the working class, then Jews cannot be properly working class because they are bourgeois and they are powerful and they are exploiters. Or if we define our community as anti-imperialist, then Jews cannot be a proper part of the community of anti-imperialism or anti-racism because Jews are white or colonialist or imperialist or Zionist. So whatever community is posited, Jews are, in the anti-Semitic imagination, not part of it. Why? Because they are only concerned with their own selves and their own global conspiracies. And number three really is about anti-Semitism after the Holocaust, because the Holocaust seems to have been so huge that anti-Semitism then has to relate to that fact, either by denial or by finding the Jews responsible in various kinds of ways. There's another thing that I want to introduce here, really. If you like, David Nirenberg wrote a book about anti-Semitism, and he portrays anti-Semitism very persuasively, really, as a kind of 3,000-year-old history. And he shows how it's always kind of similar. So you can look at the way the Jews were treated in Egypt in the time of Moses, or early Christianity, or the Spanish Inquisition, or the blood libel in England in the Middle Ages, or the expulsion of the Jews from England. Or you can look at nationalist anti-Semitism in Europe in the 19th century, or anti-nationalist anti-Semitism, or modernist anti-Semitism, or anti-modernist anti-Semitism, or socialist anti-Semitism, or anti-socialist anti-Semitism. So it's kind of interesting that I suppose a study of anti-Semitism warns us against embracing one particular identity or worldview, because we can see how they have all found a way to construct Jews as their other. And of course, I will come on to talk about 20th century totalitarianism, which constructed Jews as the enemy of the people, not nationally, not on the level of the nation state, but globally. The 20th century totalitarian movements, Nazism and also Stalinism, were not national movements. Well, they were a little bit national movements. They were movements which made use of greater Russian nationalism or German nationalism, but fundamentally they were movements for world domination. And the Jews were very important to them as an other, because the Jews, the anti-Semitic notion of the Jews could be borrowed as a global cosmopolitan other. But I was saying, so Nuremberg has this picture of anti-Semitism as being basically just a fact of human history, which manifests itself differently in every different time. But Hannah Arendt kind of does the opposite. She warns us against that notion of anti-Semitism, that we need to understand the specificities of each anti-Semitism and each time and each movement. So the social context of early Christian anti-Semitism at the time of St. Paul, for example, is profoundly different from the social context of the Spanish Inquisition or the Dreyfus affair in France in the late 19th century, or the rise of the Nazis, or what may or may not happen in the Middle East today. So Arendt says, no, you need to do much more than simply have a kind of universalist understanding of anti-Semitism as a fact of human history. You need to understand each anti-Semitism in its own context and in its own way. But then you have a problem, and the problem is that each new anti-Semitism, as my friend David Seymour has shown so interestingly, each new anti-Semitism begins by denouncing the one before. So each new, for example, Wilhelm Marr, who coined the term anti-Semitism as a positive term to describe himself, he said, you know, this old-fashioned Christian anti-Semitism which blames the Jews for murdering God, it's ridiculous and it's unjust and it's not true. But in our day, it so happens that today's Jews actually do what they were irrationally accused of doing in previous times. So each new appearance of anti-Semitism in a new time and in a new way begins by denouncing the old, and then by recreating its patterns and borrowing some of its tropes. So that's one of the ways in which 20th century totalitarianism was so attracted to anti-Semitism, partly because it enabled them to have a conspiratorial, powerful, global other, but also because they used the anti-Semitic notion of the Jews as a way to illustrate the face of evil, the enemy of the people. And these feelings, these emotionally live images and tropes were available. And they were available to be kind of picked up again from older times and places and movements and reused. So let me just move swiftly. I'm going to show you some images of the blood libel. So blood libel is what happens later on. So for example, here in England in the 12th century in Norwich, a child was murdered, and the Jews were accused of murdering the child. Now already, just from that sentence, you know that something is wrong, because who murders a child? A person murders a child, or a conspiracy murders a child. But the Jews do not murder a child. You see what I mean? So already we have this kind of predicate of the anti-Semitic notion of the Jews. And the blood libel says that not only did the Jews, 1,000 years ago already, murder Jesus and reject God, but they reenact the murder of Jesus in every time for their own religious reasons. And so they have a kind of evil religion, and they reject the good religion. They have an evil particularist religion, which is about themselves as the chosen people, and they reject the universalist good news of Christianity. And part of their evil religion is to reenact the murder of Christ, and they do it on the body of prepubescent children, non-Jewish children. And very often blood libels have elements where they, the Jews are accused of taking the blood of those children in order for their religious ritual, and often to consume it. And here's another medieval image of the blood libel. And one of the interesting things about both the blood libel and conspiracy is that these tropes and these images appear again and again and again throughout history, right? They have no truth in them. They are each time shown to have no truth in them, but they resonate. People like them, and people like them because they like having a face to put on to the conspiracy which takes away our money and our power and our agency. This blood libel image is from Poland. You can see that it has the more kind of modern Jews in their black hats and their black coats murdering a child. It looks like a party, that one. They look like they're having fun murdering that child. There was a blood libel scandal in Damascus in 1840 in the Middle East. So you can see it travels around. It's a lie that won't die. It's a very, very strong and emotionally satisfying way of really picturing the face of evil. These two guys in the middle there was a Christian monk and his servant, and the Jews were accused of having murdered them in Damascus. Of course, in Damascus, as everywhere else, it was not true. Murder is, and consumption of blood is not part of the Jewish tradition or the Jewish ritual. I mean, obviously that goes without saying, I think. This is a Nazi version of the blood libel. So the Nazis, they live in a different time. They live in a time of you know, later capitalism. In fact, capitalism, which is in some trouble. Nazism is a whole different business from early Christianity. But look, these images resonate, and they can be picked up and used for new purposes, actually. And this is a more contemporary one from the Middle East, which portrays the innocent Jesus as being a Palestinian, and the Israeli imperialist Zionist as murdering the Palestinians. And the caption says, "Do not kill him twice." Now, I'm going to use a few of these images which are contemporary and from the Middle East and relating to Israel. I think this image shows very clearly the problem, right? And I'm not going to be talking about Israeli politics, and I'm not going to be talking about the Israel and Palestine conflict. What I am interested in, and of course the Israel-Palestine conflict is real, and it's unpleasant, and it's nasty, and people suffer, and for sure the Palestinians suffer as part of it. But what I'm interested in really is not the conflict itself, but the ways in which the conflict is understood through the narrative of anti-Semitism. So on the one hand, you have the real conflict, which people can discuss and show solidarity with in various kinds of ways. But on the other hand, you have a view of the conflict through the language of anti-Semitism. And you can see in this example is very clear that the portrayal of an innocent Palestinian Jesus figure and an irrationally, murderously evil Zionist figure with blood on his hands. There's always blood in blood libel images. So let me illustrate that in another way. This is from this very recent picture from after the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And interestingly, both the New York Times and the Israeli liberal newspaper Haaretz carried a front page, which is just after the conflict, and it showed images of every one of the Palestinian children who were said to have died in the recent conflict. And it was quite controversial, and it was controversial for a number of reasons. For example, it was obvious that some of the faces were not really children who had died in the conflict. Because why? Because the images could only have come through the official channels from Gaza, which were not believable. And so some of the images turned out to be predictably inaccurate. But, you know, overall, there was a conflict and children did die. So the reason it's controversial to show the dead children in this way is because some people said that this opens the story up to an anti-Semitic interpretation. On the one hand, you have a conflict between two sides. You have I mean, one could discuss how one sees the conflict in many ways, and I'm perfectly open to that. But the understanding that the conflict was really about child killing, or the portraying of the conflict in a way which could be understood in that way, has a particular kind of resonance into the history of anti-Semitism, as I've just shown you. So on the one hand, it's interesting that it was done within Israel itself, and then in the New York Times. So the Israelis, the liberal Israelis said, no, this can't possibly be an anti-Semitic image because we are doing it ourselves. But of course, we live in a globalized world. So on the bottom right here, you see a tweet which carries the New York Times pictures in exactly the way that people feared that they might be carried. And the tweet says they were just children. Israel slaughtered them. Palestinian children murdered by Israel, on the front page of the New York Times. Now, of course, the children were not murdered. They were civilians who died as part of a war. Now, of course, you can say the war should never have been fought. You can say Israel should have made peace. You can say Israel should not be interested in what happens in Gaza. You can say all sorts of things, but the murder of children is not what happened. And there's the quote from Tariq Ali there too. Also, the idea that Israel, through its pure evil, murders children. So you have always a slippage between the actual conflict, in which people who are under the age of 18 die, for sure, and other ways of describing that which draw on old tropes and anti-Semitic feelings and emotions. So the other major history of anti-Semitism is conspiracy. And this is in particular illustrated through the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a book that was written by anti-Semites, by people who were in the tradition of anti-Semitism, who hated Jews. And the book pretended to be a report of the global conspiracy of the Jews in a graveyard in Prague, in Czech. And of course, the point is that the book was forged. It was forged by people who were close to the authorities in Russia. And it was forged in order to create trouble for Jews and to foment anti-Semitism. And here you see, I've got a few illustrations of the front pages of different editions of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You can see these key images that kind of are held together by the Jews. Each of these is one finger of the Jews, right? Dollars, Christianity, Nazism, communism, Freemasonry. This is a French version. This is another French version which shows the caricature of the Jew with the long nose, looking evil and disgusting, digging his fingers into the world in a kind of imperialist manner. You can see the bodies or the skeletons underneath, and you can see that all of the misery in the world is caused by le péril juif, the Jewish peril. This was an English version of the Protocols, published 1920 in England. And this is an image of Trotsky. So after the Russian Revolution, the anti-Bolsheviks, the anti-communists, I think this must be during the time of the Civil War, portray Bolshevism as a Jewish conspiracy. You can see that a good man there is being shot. You can see that Trotsky is portrayed as being not properly human, that he doesn't have proper human hands and feet, but he has hands and feet which are a bit like the devil, and he is red like the devil. He does not have horns in this image, but very often, of course, Jews are portrayed by anti-Semitism as having horns. And you can see the man under the bridge, the reality. The man seems to be responsible for all of those skulls, and you can see he's just about to do something awful to that nice, innocent girl. So that was a anti-Soviet cartoon, and this is a pro-Soviet cartoon. This is the capitalist being shaken by the workers' state, the Soviet Union, and you can see the mask comes off. The mask is a smiling, nice, jolly chap, but beneath is the ugliness of the vicious Jewish capitalist, and he's shaking. You can see the money falling out of his pocket, and you can see that his hands are not properly human hands either. And these are two images which are fairly contemporary. The top one is one of the clearest blood libel images I've ever seen, actually, portrays, well, Israel, really, or it's not entirely clear if it's Israel or if it's the sort of Jewish conspiracy, eating a Palestinian child, chopping him up, eating him, drinking the blood from the glass, and with the one hand using an Arabic knife and the other hand using an American fork. So again, one may have any kind of rational view of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is real, but the temptations to describe the Israel-Palestine conflict in the language of anti-Semitism are huge. And the other image is interesting too. This is a mainstream liberal newspaper in Britain from April 2006. And this was a piece about America, and it was the argument that America was sent to war against Iraq, against Saddam Hussein, by Israel. And so the American Stars and Stripes is shown as being really and truly underneath it, an Israeli puppet. And the puppetry images, we see them a lot. Either Israel is the puppet of America or America is the puppet of Israel. Let me move on. I'm not sure how long I should speak because I could actually speak for hours. There are many, many things I'd like to say. One of which is that anti-Semitism, in a sense, is almost foundational to Europe. Of course, the new Europe, the Europe of the European Union and of Brexit, is in some sense founded on the idea of having overcome and defeated 20th century totalitarianism, and in particular the Holocaust. But going back to the beginnings of European nation states, you had Europe stepping outwards into the world and constructing non-white people as being a kind of external other to Europe, which was important for its economic and global projects. But at the same time as anti-Black racism and anti-non-white racism is becoming normalized in Europe to do with colonialism, anti-Semitism is constructing an internal other to Europe, an internal enemy, an enemy which is not external but is treacherous and amongst us. So the rise of anti-Semitism is in some senses, or the rise of this form of anti-Semitism is in some senses parallel to the rise of racism. I'm going to skip through some of these slides because I really do not have time. This is some really interesting stuff about 20th century totalitarianism, which I do not have time to go through right now. I do want to talk a little bit about the Holocaust, and I will say something about 20th century totalitarianism. The Jews, or the anti-Semitic notion of the Jews, the Nazi notion of the Jews, was central to everything for the Nazis, right? The Nazis understood the Jews as being the key to history, as being central to everything bad that happened in the world. And the kind of enormity of the Holocaust is something to see, really. The Holocaust was about defining this almost superhuman and universal and global other. And it was about defining every Jew who existed as being a representative or a part of the other. And it was about taking the territory of the whole of Europe, and if they could, the whole of the world. And it was about combing that territory for actual flesh and blood Jewish men and women, which of course had nothing to do with the anti-Semitic notion of the key to history, and killing them first in a kind of haphazard and random way, and then using soldiers and squads, and then industrializing it into a kind of factory system. And I want to move on to the idea of left-wing anti-Semitism, which I think is, I think it's important that there is a long set of traditions of left-wing anti-Semitism. And it's also true that there have always been people on the left who opposed and fought against left anti-Semitism. So that, again, as I said with Christianity, that Christianity itself is not anti-Semitic, but there is a tradition of anti-Semitic Christianity. So the left in itself is not anti-Semitic, but there are people on the left who have always been attracted towards that kind of conspiracy fantasy as though it was an anti-capitalism. And it's an authentic, so sometimes people will say, well, it's impossible. How could the left be anti-Semitic? Because the left is against anti-Semitism, the left is against racism, the left is, you know, treats every human being as equal. And therefore, by definition, there cannot be a left anti-Semitism. And if somebody is anti-Semitic, then they must thereby be defined as being on the right. Moishe Postone is somebody actually who died 2 or 3 years ago, a very, very great man in my view, a very, very great Marxist who was a Marxist critic of Marxist anti-Semitism. And he wrote this, he said, anti-Semitism can appear to be anti-hegemonic. This is the reason why a century ago, August Bebel characterized it as the socialism of fools. Given its subsequent development, it could also have been called the anti-imperialism of fools. Hi, sorry, does somebody need to say something to me?
Sorry, somebody.
No? Yes, no? Shall I carry on?
Dr. Hirsh, you go ahead.
Okay. So Postone goes on, as a fetishized form of oppositional consciousness. In other words, anti-Semitism is can be a form of oppositional consciousness, a form of anti-hegemonic thought, but it's fetishized. It doesn't focus on the structures of capitalism, which one should really oppose. It focuses on a kind of a pretend, an image of the structures that should really be opposed. It's fetishized. It is particularly dangerous because it appears to be an anti-hegemonic, to be the expression of a movement of the little people against an intangible global form of domination. Anti-Semitism is, as a fetishized, profoundly reactionary form of anti-capitalism, that I would like to begin discussing the recent surge of modern anti-Semitism in the Arab world. So Postone is very keen to make sure that people understand that there is a genuinely left-wing tradition of genuine anti-Semitism, and that begins with the anti-Semitism which Marx himself critiqued, Bruno Bauer in The Jewish Question, with Dühring, with Bakunin, and later on, I'm getting an echo back. Somebody's turned off their mute, I think. Let me move on. I'm going to say a couple of things actually, and then I'm going to move on, talk a little bit about Robert Fine, and I think I need about another 10 minutes, if that's okay. So the 20th century totalitarianism, which I've talked a little bit about, is a radical critique of existing society. The liberal notion of the democratic state says that human beings are all different. They have different abilities. They are in different classes and different genders and different sexualities and different ethnicities and different religions and different races. And the idea of the liberal account of the state, the liberal state, is that the complexity of the state and civil society and the voluntary institutions that people build and the state institutions into which people participate mediate all these different interests in diverse flesh and blood human beings, and they find a way for us to live together. They make laws, they have parliaments, they define the sphere of freedom and the sphere of law. And the sphere of law or politics guarantees and creates the sphere of freedom, and it also sets a boundary to freedom. We're not allowed to just do anything, but we're allowed to do anything which we do not have laws against. Now, populism, firstly 20th century totalitarianism, and then populism comes along, and it says fundamentally that that liberal account of the democratic state is fake. Fundamentally, we do not live in a world where there is a diversity of human beings in that way. Fundamentally, we live in a world where there is the elite and the people, and the elite is a conspiracy controlling the people, and the elite controls the media and news, and in the words of Donald Trump, the elite puts out fake news, or in the words of media studies, puts out the state authorized version of the American dream, or what have you. And the elite pretends to be liberal, it pretends to be democratic, but really it's only in it for itself. And so populism constructs the people as the kind of great big mass of human beings as a single entity, which is spoken for by a single big powerful man who promises to lead the people against the elite. And we've seen it in recent politics in terms of in America and in Britain, I suspect in India too, but I'm not going to step into the world of Indian politics, but we see the strong man speaking for the people against the cosmopolitans and the globalists and finance capital, against the liberal elites, against the educated, against the liberal, against the people in the big cities, the metropolitans. And the reason that populism, well, many reasons, but one of the reasons why populism is a worry to me is because this splitting of the world between the people and the enemy of the people has frequently led to the temptation to put a face on the liberal elite, on the conspiracy, and that face has often been the face, the Jewish face, the face of the anti-Semitic notion of the Jews. I just skipped over a couple of slides, one of which was Donald Trump. This one is George Soros in Hungary. And this poster has George Soros, who is this image of the Jewish capitalist, the man that broke the Bank of England, the man who is, you know, rich beyond anybody's possible imagination, and who is a Jewish cosmopolitan. And the Viktor Orban stands for election in Hungary with this great big picture of Soros looking down on you, saying, and Orban says, don't let Soros have the last laugh. He's laughing at you. He's conning you. He's fooling you. He's exploiting you. You should vote for me because I'm the only one strong enough to represent the people against the likes of George Soros. And I have lots of images similar. That's Soros as the puppet master. This time he's controlling Tony Blair. Tony Blair's speaking against Brexit and the breakup of the European Union. But the campaign to leave the European Union shows who's really behind Brexit. The people really behind it are the Jewish international globalist liberal elite financiers. This is another Brexit poster, actually, which shows one of the leaders of the Brexit campaign in Britain, Nigel Farage, pointing at what the problem is with the European Union. And the problem with the European Union is that the European Union is going to bring in non-white people into Britain. And look at them, says Nigel Farage. Look at what they look like. These people are being brought in to Britain by this metropolitan, liberal, cosmopolitan elite. And that's how populism works. This guy is Robert Bowers. He went into a synagogue in Pittsburgh a couple of years ago, and he shot Jews. And the reason he shot Jews, or the reason he thought he was shooting Jews, is because he thought that the Jews were responsible for bringing in non-white people into America in order to dilute the white race in America. So 20th century totalitarianism and populism and the racist groups who are kind of around populism it's quite an interesting direction at the moment, because for people like Robert Bowers, the Jews are at the heart of the evils posed by everybody who's not white. On the other hand, you have a kind of split in a different way between this idea that the Jews in fact are white and the Jews are part of the pro-colonial, pro-imperialist global order, and the Jews are key to oppressing non-white people, and the Jews are key to racism and to imperialism. So you have these kind of different and opposing narratives of Jewishness. This is a cartoon from the middle of the 20th century of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And of course, it's true that the Stalinists, pretty well nearly as much as the Hitlerists, understood the Jews to be a central category of understanding the enemy. I want to go very quickly through a little case study of left anti-Semitism in Britain recently. People may know about Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn famously referred to Hezbollah and Hamas, which are anti-Semitic and Islamist organizations in the Middle East, as his friends. And he was challenged about this, about the use of the word friend. And he sort of shrugged it off and he said, oh, no, I was being polite, that I'm for talking, I'm for a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and I had these people in the room and I was using diplomatic language. But this quote was interesting because he went on to talk about Hamas and Hezbollah as organizations dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region. So clearly articulating a political support for these organizations. Hezbollah is interesting because Hezbollah is not only anti-Semitic in its hostility to Israel, but it's also been a key and hugely murderous and oppressive force in Syria, kind of providing the troops, some of the troops to the Assad regime in Syria in breaking the uprising which began during the Arab Spring. So Corbyn comes from this world where the world is divided into two. There's imperialism and there's anti-imperialism, and Israel takes this position as a kind of keystone of anti-imperialism. It kind of goes back to what I said right at the beginning about the Enlightenment, that there are two ways of responding to the Enlightenment. Marx's way of responding to the Enlightenment was to say what we need to do is to complete the Enlightenment, to make the autonomous rational subject real for everybody. So to fight exploitation on the basis of class, to fight capitalism, to fight racism and imperialism, and thereby to create democracy for human beings. And the other narrative was one which said that in fact the Enlightenment was the system that men and capitalists and imperialists found to pretend that they were liberal and for equality. And instead of hoping to complete the Enlightenment, we should hope to destroy the Enlightenment and destroy all of the thinking which came with it. I'm gonna go through a whole lot of interesting stuff actually that I'm not going to talk about right now. And I want to finish by talking about Robert Fine, who in my view is a very important sociologist and was my friend and was also my teacher, my PhD supervisor. He died again at about the same time as Moshe Postone, not too long ago. And Robert Fine is very, very interesting because I think what he does is to look back at this kind of founding idea of sociology and critical theory as a way of understanding the world through a structural account. So I want to, so one of the things that Fine does is he's got this book which is called Political Investigations, Hegel, Marx and Arendt. And he talks about Hegel, who came after the French Revolution. So everybody, of course, supported the French Revolution and its egalitarian ideas. But as we know, the French Revolution finished in terror. And Hegel is trying to understand the world again. He's trying to understand Kant and Kant's egalitarianism in a world where not only has the French Revolution made it real, but has ended in terror. So Hegel writes after the terror and after the liberation. Marx writes after the defeated revolutions of 1848, and Hannah Arendt writes after 20th century totalitarianism. And the thing that links these three writers, certainly in the way that Robert Fine talks about them, the thing that links them is their understanding that the critique of existing conditions is very, very important, but we need also to worry about the possible outcomes of the critique. Let me go through, in fact, it's a quite a long quote, but for me it's very important, and I will finish on this point. And then people can ask me, we can go back to people can ask me whatever they like about things that I haven't covered. So Fine says, this is the last paragraph of his book, Political Investigations. So it's if you like a kind of summation of the book and a sort of introduction to his next book, which is on cosmopolitanism, and the book after that, which is on anti-Semitism. So Fine says, the call of modern philosophy is to understand a world which now knows Auschwitz and the Gulag. The Gulag is the Soviet terror. How do we understand modern philosophy in a world which now knows Auschwitz and the Gulag, and which is daily confronted by echoes of their hatred of humanity? So the 20th century totalitarianisms which came out of modern philosophy, out of movements, radical critiques of existing society. How do we exist now in a world where we are daily confronted by the echoes of their hatred of humanity? It is at least one way in which, as Hegel wrote, we reaffirm our subjective freedom in the realm of the substantial, worldliness. The word haunts Arendt's writings in its multiple meanings. Worldliness as a declaration of human right beyond parochial allegiance. In other words, universalism. Worldliness as a recognition that both reason and horror lie objectively in the world, not just in how we see the world. Worldliness as the practical wisdom of those who, by hook and crook, know how to construct a touch of humanity in the most forbidding of circumstances. Worldliness as the satisfaction of comprehending the present and the actual, not setting up some world beyond which exists God knows where. Worldliness as facing up to the burden of events, not to indulge the cold draught of despair, not to confess that things are bad, but nothing better can be expected here, not to accept what is not justified in thought. And there is a lot of that kind of anti-utopian thought around that people on the left and sometimes social theorists have kind of given up on making the world better, have given up on understanding the world and how it might be made better, because they have a sort of idealist and utopian idea that the world is just compromised. And then social theory and politics becomes a kind of moral enterprise, that the world is hopeless, but I can be saved by extricating myself from responsibility for the hopelessness of the world. And Fine and his idea of worldliness, I think, is bringing us back to the world, to the idea of universality of human beings, but also particularism of particular actions, particular communities, particular people, particular interests. That's funny. I thought I had one more slide. Oops. Oh, I did have one more slide and it's here. Sorry. And Fine talks about the agenda that he would like to pursue, and which death has prevented him from pursuing, actually. It is an agenda which confronts the central perplexity of modern political life, that the critique of representation cannot rest content until it links hands with the critique of the critique. And this duality between the critique and the critique of the critique seems to me to be really important. And it's what we learned through 20th century totalitarianism with its various anti-Semitisms, that the critique of existing condition is not enough. We also have to understand the critique of the critique, the potential of the critique, and the potential of how things might go wrong. And it seems to me there's much too little of that in contemporary sociology, contemporary politics. There's much too little fear. I think it was George Orwell who said that being on the left, what did he said? Most of the left live in a world where it was something about playing with fire, but they do not even understand that fire is hot. The idea that in contemporary sociology and contemporary social theory, there's much more emphasis on the critique of existing conditions as though the world was profoundly compromised, and much less emphasis on the difficulties of rebuilding the world materially so that it is better and not worse. His project is not afraid of complexity. It does not run away from it. It does not seek to resolve it with premature judgments and conclusions, nor does it use it as an excuse for inaction in the face of injustice. So we keep the critique of existing conditions, but we also keep the critique of the potential changes which that critique might take place. Rather than attempt to master perplexity and subsume it to the will of the subject, it is prepared to give the rope to see where it takes us. It does not deny normative judgment, but it dethrones it and puts it back from where it came, in the world where no sphere of innocence survives, and the most dangerous man is he who nonetheless proclaims his innocence. The most dangerous man is he who thinks and portrays himself as innocent. I'm going to stop there. I hope we have some time for people to ask me some questions. And I hope people are still with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hirsh. It's a wonderful lecture by you for about an hour. You gave a very brief overview of the sociology and anti-Semitism. Thank you so much. Now I would like to request Dr. Nupur Patnaik from the Koraput Central University. She will give a comment on this, very quick comment on this topic within 1 minute. Dr. Patnaik.
Yeah, thank you so much. Am I audible? Clearly?
Yes, clearly.
Yes.
You go ahead.
A very good evening to India, and good morning to our guest David Hirsh sir. And first, I would like to say that it was a brilliant presentation on anti-Semitism. I think that it's really a very eye-opening thing, and many of us may have known this thing, but many of us may have not gone through in-depth analysis into this. So as sir, you have explained about anti-Semitism as an epistemic framework to explain the social pathologies that has existed in the Western countries, among the Jews and the Christianity and Jews, how they are having this particular notion of anti-Semitism, and how we can also relate it with the sociology framework in the Constitution of Sociology, where you have mentioned about the works of Emil Durkheim, Karl Marx, Hegel, and many other theorists who have talked about this particular notion of how there is hostility. As you have said, anti-Semitism is a hostility towards a particular ethnic group or religious group, and that is the Jews in the Western country. So that is what, sir, you have tried to explain it in a very excellent way. And the way you have portrayed the pictures, it was so reflective about the things that was happening. And the picture spoke a lot, and how today, how you have explained about the paradigms of anti-Semitism and how the depth, the Jews connected with that, and how the politics and the media is also influenced in the Western countries with this anti-Semitism phenomena, and how sociologically, how we can relate anti-Semitism from ancient times to the post-modernity, And in India also, I would like to relate this thing that we have this concept of regionalism, racism, or a kind of linguism, or many type of communalism. We have also this kind of we can relate this anti-Semitism with this particular phenomena that we have in the Western, and today also it still continues, as you have said. And what are the suggestions also you have given us how we could get rid of this particular thing of anti-Semitism. So excellent presentation, sir. We are indeed indebted to you. Thank you so much, sir. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
you, Dr. Patnaik.
Thank you so much.
If Dr. Jena give any comment, Dr. Jena, or if you will not give any comment, then we'll go for the question answer session. There are some. Dr. Jena, can you? Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dr. Jena.
Thank you so much, Professor. He is such a very wonderful, engaging evening to India and many of participants. This is your book, The Anti-Semitism, Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism. One of the of your close friends, Samren, who gifted this book, and I gone through more than 1.5 years, but literally I cannot even understand the theoretical promises you did. I want to know, what is the idea? How could you relate the anti-Semitism, in particular? This one guy came from sociology background, and they try to find out the problems of the whole world, particularly the Jewish community is concerned. And my second question is, Professor Hirsh, I know you are an excellent mind of our times for the global audience in terms of media and Hollywood. I want to know the entire methodological aspect. You are using the tool of methodology to write this book. How could you relate the methodological conspiracy, in particular the time when we are in a wake of pandemic curve, and then we should things have been not in a proper order. The world is in disappearing promotion of these media people. And what is your ideas about the LPG as concern? The LPG and concern and the post-globalization, when people are got emotionally connected after post-truth narration, exactly 2014 onwards. Thank you so much, Professor Hirsh.
Wow, there's a lot there. Thank you so much for the question and for reading my book, and thank you to Dr. Nupur for your brilliant comments. In terms of method, I think there are a number of interesting things to say. One is really in the spirit of the what I said about Robert Fine, is that I think that my method, or my understanding of sociology as a method, is that sociology always begins as an empirical enterprise. If you like, the difference between sociology and philosophy is that we begin by looking at the world in a very kind of material way. We begin in the world, and we then, for sure, we can think philosophically, and we can think about the world that we see and that we measure and that we describe and that we observe. But we start in the world and we think about how the world might change, how it might get better or how it might get worse, what are the dangers or what are the possibilities. But sociology is a kind of cosmopolitan materialism. It's a very worldly exercise. So I don't know, for example, if in my book I'm thinking about how certain kinds of hostility to Israel relate to anti-Semitism, the way I want to answer that question is not to look inside of my own head and to say, you know, is this kind of criticism, is it anti-Semitic or is it justified criticism? What I would like to do is start in the world and start to see how movements which are critical of Israel and movements which are anti-Semitic, how they relate to each other, how what they say are similar or are different, how they overlap, how one becomes the other. So it's a method of looking at the world in its complexity. And it's not a method of abstracting elements of rhetoric or particular ideas and looking at them the abstract. So that's one thing I would say about method in relation to my book. And there's another, which is really quite obvious in a way, and quite sort of almost funny, but also sad, is that sociology has certain insights in how the world works, in how human beings create norms and practices and ways of doing things and ways of thinking, which seem to be natural, but which are in fact constructed socially, and social communities and organizations they find ways of thinking which are sometimes exclusionary, and sometimes all kinds of exclusions happen that people are not themselves aware of. So sociology is quite good on that. But sociology is not good on looking at itself in that way. And sociology finds it very difficult to look at itself according to the kinds of method that it develops for looking at other people. And as I say, in a sense, it's almost funny, but it's also kind of quite sad. And I think the self-awareness of sociology is sometimes a problem. And that's why my work, which looks at, well, my work really, at least that book was looking at the sort of anti-hegemonic movement. And of course, sociology in itself is largely an anti-hegemonic movement. And so the object of my study, partly anyway, is sociology. But the method of my study is also sociology. So that to me is very interesting. And it doesn't necessarily make me popular.
Thank you, Professor Hirsh. But there are some of the questions in the chat box. If you go as quickly as possible, if you'll answer these questions as briefly as possible, it will be better for us. There are some few questions in the chat box. Can you see
love to.
the questions?
I haven't looked yet, so I'm now looking for the first time.
You can read out the questions for Professor Hirsh.
Yes, I'm just going through.
Yes,
There's a question. There's a question from Shatabdi Benia. She has asked about the book, about the Merchant of Venice, an anti-Semitic play, or is it a play which intimately depicts the anatomy of persecution, exclusion, and bullying against a Jewish character? So my question here is how do you contextualize the Merchant of Venice?
Oh, wow, that's a really interesting question. So people who've seen my book will know that it begins actually as a preface with a discussion of a particular performance of the Merchant of Venice. And in fact, I had this piece of writing and I didn't really know how to fit it into my book. And somebody said, it just works on its own, just put it at the beginning. And that's what I did. So Shakespeare is very interesting to me in himself, actually. I mentioned Gillian Rose, and Gillian Rose was very much a continental philosopher, and she would say that the English didn't really have an equivalent continental philosopher. She said, but Shakespeare was the English philosopher. And Shakespeare is writing at the time of early modernity. And I think very, very interestingly, even at the very beginning of modernity, Shakespeare is already looking at the issues of gender and race and racism and anti-Semitism critically, which I think is already a really interesting counterweight to the sort of postmodern paradigm, where, like, postmodernism says there's this pre-modern world and then the modern world, and now postmodernism, and postmodernism brings back the sort of ethical that was destroyed by modernity, and everything is very much in a time period. But when you look at modernity and you see that right at the beginning of modernity, Shakespeare was already engaging critically with it, I think that's much more interesting. And Kant, for example, at the beginning of the nation state was already talking about cosmopolitanism. So these critical discourses are not something that comes after, but there's something that is part of modernity, and that's very interesting to me. So what does Shakespeare do with anti-Semitism? Also very interesting. He's looking at Venice, I think, as the future. Venice was this sort of trading city that seemed to be well ahead of Britain, and particularly in terms of the rule of law. Venice didn't have material wealth. It was a trading center. What does a trading center need? The trading center needs the rule of law to make trade possible. And so people could do their trading in Venice. So there's this plot kind of created around the idea of the rule of law. And I can't go into the whole discussion, but it seems to me that Shakespeare, at the very least, gives you this really interesting Jewish character and shows you how the Jewish character is treated really appallingly in Venice at that time. And I think Shakespeare is a little bit playing with the audience, because he's inviting the audience to enjoy the bullying of the Jew, but he's also showing you how awful the bullying of the Jew is, and he's doing the two things at the same time. And so I think it's a very sophisticated piece of work, and obviously my view is that Shakespeare is showing you that anti-Semitism was itself not only an injustice, but was also something that was quite deeply embedded into the very beginnings of modern Europe. In a way, people talk a lot about race in America, that racism is embedded into the modern America, and I think perhaps in a similar way, anti-Semitism is embedded in Europe. Thank you for that question again, which shows that people are really reading.
Next question.
Yeah, the next question here is that this is from Imran. So he has asked this question is that how do we get rid of this anti-Semitic ideology? Like how do we get rid of in this modern era, though we come across, so how do we get rid of this? So that is his question.
Yeah, thank you, Imran. Look, I obviously, if I knew how to get rid of it, I would get rid of it. I think that what is interesting to me about this question is, again, going back to the Robert Fine paradigm that I was talking about, is to look at how things connect together with each other. So there are lots of tasks and lots of values and lots of frameworks which are important. One of them, which is very, very important to me, is anti-Semitism, and to kind of counteract, to stop people from defining their own political identities in relation to Israel or the Jews or the Palestinians, to relate to Israel and Palestine in a material way as a conflict between, you know, material and diverse human beings, and not to relate to it in a way as a kind of Bible story, as a way of defining my own good and my own evil, and the Palestinians as the paradigmatic victims and the Jews as the paradigmatic villains. But also I want to say that there are lots of values that are important. As I say, opposing anti-Semitism is important, but being for peace is also important, and opposing colonialism is important, and understanding the injustices of post-colonialism is important, but also understanding 20th century totalitarianism is important, and understanding how Stalinism has impacted on our critical and left-wing thought. So we're in a world where there are many frameworks and many requirements and many kinds of politics, and we have to deal with the perplexity and the complexity. And so what I'm saying is that we cannot just pick one value, you know, opposing colonialism or opposing anti-Semitism or opposing inequality or opposing racism. We have to understand how these different ways of thinking and these different political aspirations and these difficult scholarly frameworks react one with the other. And as I said, for the example, I think I didn't, Frantz Fanon, for example, or Paul Gilroy say very clearly that the fight against anti-Semitism is the same as the fight against racism. And I showed that with the idea that the Jews are even at the very heart of the threat of non-whites. And on the other hand, you have people who say the opposite, who say that through Zionism and imperialism, the Jews are at the very heart, not of the threat of non-whiteness, but at the very heart of racism. So what I'm trying to say, I think, is that we need to understand the different values and the different frameworks in their complexity and how they relate to each other. Not only the universal, but also the particular, and not only the critique of the universal, but also the critique of the particular. But at the same time, I'm not arguing that everything should be problematized so much that we lose any chance to understand, because understanding requires simplification. So what I'm saying is we have a very difficult job and we need complexity, but we also need clarity.
Next question.
The next question is from Rudra Narayan Das. He has asked about the consequences when a single story is used to exclude a group of people from a society's universe of obligation.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you. So I think that relates to what I was just saying, that a kind of single concern abstracted from a whole number of interlinking concerns creates a problem. But I like the way you articulate something that I've tried to articulate, which is the idea of excluding people from a society's universe of obligation. And the term I used for that in my book was the community of the good. That the community of the good is sometimes set up with very kind of simple boundaries. So, for example, we saw during the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, we saw many academic institutions throughout the world putting out statements, and all the statements said more or less the same thing. They said that Israel is an evil, it's connected to imperialism, it's unchangeably and essentially racist, it must be boycotted, and it must be destroyed in the way that apartheid South Africa was destroyed. And then these statements all said, this understanding is foundational to our scholarship and it's foundational to our personal morality. In other words, you must believe this, because if you do not believe this, you're not a scholar and you're not moral. You're not a person, really. And by the way, I don't believe that. I believe something else. And I feel that these statements do precisely what the question mentions, which is to exclude a group of people, in this case, the overwhelming majority of Jews, from a society's universe of obligation, in this case, the university, the community of scholars. And so obviously I find that very threatening. I find it a kind of damage to the very notion of the university, to the very notion of the community of scholars. And it's done, again, in a very unself-reflective way. It's done by people who think that they themselves have a very clear understanding of what's right and wrong. And one of the things that we see about contemporary anti-Semitism is that the people who embrace anti-Semitic ideas and who construct these exclusions from a society's universe of obligations are people who believe themselves to be the good people. The people who believe themselves to be the anti-racists, people who believe themselves to be opponents of anti-Semitism, as Robert Fine said in that quote, I'm just looking, the most dangerous man is he who nonetheless proclaims his innocence, he who believes himself to be innocent. And it was often asked to me about Jeremy Corbyn, you know, is he a sort of cynical, calculating politician? Is he looking for the Muslim vote or something like that? And my answer was always no, that he's not. He's a true believer and he believes himself to be good. And that in a way is much more terrifying than a kind of cynical, calculating politician.
Thank you, Professor Hirsh. I think there is no question. Is there any question from anybody?
No, there is no question.
There is no question. Okay, yes. There is last comment by Dr. Jena. Last comment by Dr. Jena. We'll give the last comment. Dr. Jena.
Sir, yeah.
The last comment, and then we'll go for the
so much,
Professor
Hirsh, for all the fantastic answers given by you. We are looking forward to the culture, language, nature, and the identity of marginalized sections of this whole globe. What is your ideas about a topmost sociologist of our time? How could you relate this story with the anti-Semitism, with the urban marginalization or rural marginalization? What I observed in last 10 years and more than one decade, the world academics less concerns about the phenomenon of these less empirical and more theoretical analysis. And entire academia, they don't believe in activism world. There is a very binarical gap between the activist world and the academics world. How could you relate this story? Suppose my example is that one side you saw the work of Samrendra Das and Felix and many more, and one side the many more academicians, those are writing for API scores and the very 3P, power, position and promotion. How could you relate this story in a particular sense of time in global order? Thank you.
That was a question. I should come back?
Yeah.
Okay. Look, I think one of the problems that we have is the creation, as I said, of rather simple and simplistic narratives of power. One example might be the kind of construction of anti-imperialism or anti-colonialism as a kind of absolute and official position and framework of the whole of academia. Now, it seems to me, and I think anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism is, of course, an important element of a number of elements that I think make up what we need to think about and what we need to do. But if you erect it as a preeminent value, a kind of absolute value, then one of the things it does, for example, is to say that the only real power dynamic in the world is between, you know, the white European and American center and the post-colonial periphery, right? It creates one power structure. And it seems to me that there are many complexities within that. So one of the kinds of complexities I'm particularly interested in are the people who get caught in between so-called imperialism and so-called anti-imperialism. So one of those groups, I think, has been the Jews. But I think also we see perhaps the Tamils, perhaps the Tutsi in Rwanda, perhaps the Kurds, perhaps the Asians in Africa. There are many, many minorities and groups of people who do not fit simply into this kind of global black-white binary. And they do not fit comfortably into a system of oppression which is understood really on one dimension. And so that seems to me one of the key problems. And one of the ways in which people have tried to address that key problem is with notions of intersectionality, for example. And I think the way that people have addressed it using intersectionality hasn't worked very well either. I think intersectionality itself is very interesting and very important. So intersectionality in Kimberly Crenshaw was an insight which said that the oppression suffered by Black women in the United States of America in the 60s was not only the oppression suffered by women added onto the oppression suffered by Black people, but it was a thing that was not just qualitatively, it was not just quantitatively one plus the other, but it was qualitatively different in itself. And that seems to me very important insight of intersectionality, but what is often done with intersectionality in the end is to do the opposite. So that, of course, the problem with that insight is that we then have, again, we get lost in a sort of infinite complexity that, you know, Black women have a different problem from women and from Black people. And then if you add in every kind of possible intersection, then you get a kind of infinite complexity. And then you lose political clarity and you lose the ability to explain things. And one of the ways in which people responded to that was to go back to a 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 of kind of adding this oppression onto that oppression and to find out who was the most oppressed. And that method was a sort of negation of the key insight of intersectionality, and it didn't work very well. If you want to ask me what is the one thing that sociology gets wrong, it's that kind of prioritizing or raising of one value as being more important than all the other values. And the other problem I think that sociology gets wrong is its own lack of self-reflectiveness. As I said at the beginning, it's about an interplay between structure and agency on a very simple level. You know, human beings make decisions and they act and they are responsible for themselves, but human beings are created by a social structure into which they are born and by which they're created. And who creates the structure? The structure is created by human beings. And who creates the human beings? The structure creates the human beings. So you have a, you know, an interesting and complex kind of dialectical relationship. And what people do all too often is to make it simple again, is to actually lose sight of agency and replace it with structure so that people are really seen as nothing but their place in a kind of global power structure. And that seems to me to be very dehumanizing. And it seems to me to go back to the problem about the Enlightenment. How do we think about the Enlightenment in very broad terms? Do we want to complete the Enlightenment? Do we want to make it real? Do we want to deliver the Enlightenment's promises? Do we want to deliver the promises of the American Declaration of Independence? Or do we say that the American Declaration of Independence was completely fatally flawed by its not taking women seriously and not taking Black people seriously, and we should just understand the Enlightenment and the Declaration of Independence to be part of what oppresses us rather than part of the way forward? And that's really one of the key questions of sociology, and I think it's a question that isn't generally answered very well.
Thank you. Can I ask one last question, sir?
Fine by me. If anybody still wants to listen.
Okay. Sir, my last question is that in India particular, when we look at these social issues, academics always overlook these social issues. More than 75 years, when we are going to celebrate next year the 75 years of independence, our senior professor, they always wondering with the jargonical word and theoretical framework, like as positivism, post-colonialism, nationalistic point of view, and post-structuralism. All these jargonical words not even exposed by these particular real world. And the second challenge is that when we are going to collect some data, I have a long experience about how fluctuate data has been created by these NGOs and these modern day researchers. People are just, work for a serious degree. No one should get into envelope particular the research of very holistic nature. If you look the entire data of last 75 years, not a single PhD should be work for the voice for public side. It's always been treated by the BA pass ICE officer, the administrative nature and arrogance people. They don't want to even push their ideas into academics, and they always try to impose these ideas. These academic people don't know, and they treated very badly. What is your idea on particular, how do we stimulate these issues in terms of highlight the social issues in particular by the academic people?
Well,
Thank you. And it's a very long question, sorry.
Thank you very, very much. So I'm not going to be tempted to talk about India because I know nothing about India, but I will just say that it seems to me India is huge and hugely diverse and is full of its own complexities of history, of languages, of ethnicities, of, I don't know what you would call them. Maybe you would call them nations, maybe you would call them, and then there's distinctions and divisions of power around caste, again, which I know very little about. But it seems to me that to look at India through a very simple framework, which is simply about colonialism and anti-colonialism and post-colonialism, cannot possibly be enough. And in fact, it's quite a menacing notion to think that you could understand today's India only in relation to colonialism, only in relation to Europe. And there is a sort of edge, it seems to me, to anti-imperialism and to anti-colonialism, which in the end gives agency only to white people. that all kinds of things happen in the world, but the only people really responsible for them are the Europeans. And I don't think that could possibly be a basis for a sociology in India. Of course, it's an important part of what India is, but it cannot possibly be a determining factor, which really is at the heart of every complexity. So I think I would say that. Sorry, I'm trying to remember what the second part of the question was. I'm sorry, either you'll have to be happy with that or you'll have to remind me.
No, okay, it's okay, sir.
Okay, sorry about that. I had an answer. Anyway,
Sir, the last question, it's not a question, it's a statement. When 70s and 60s enter globe, engaging with the ideas of society.
Oh, sorry,
now
yes.
we look.
I remember.
Now we look the society transport into market. When capitalistic approach always impose on us. And India always to be treated as a 140 crore of consumers. Entire global scenario is watching India to how to sell their products. When we are becoming consumers, then we don't have to do anything. And what is your idea about totalitarianism versus consumerism?
Right. I had something in my mind to say about data and about the way that sociology deals with data, really. And it seemed, and I wanted to say that that, as I said, sociology is first of all an empirical enterprise. We start by looking at the world, and I think sociologists have been have not been very sophisticated in their understanding of quantitative methods and their understanding of how to really look at the world and think about what is exactly going on in it. I think sociology has been too happy to really have a kind of easy look at the world, which sees what it is it wants to see and then understands it in the way it wants to understand it. I suspect that's not exactly a question to what you asked, but anyway, that was what I had in my head to say. I want to say thank you very, very much. It's been a really, really interesting experience, and I felt that people are open to a serious discussion this afternoon in a way that I don't always see on our campuses. So thank you very, very much I felt greatly respected and listened to, and thank you so much.
Thank you from our side, sir.
Thank you so much, Professor Hirsh. I think I will invite Dr. Jana. Dr. Jana?
Go for formal vote of thanks.
Okay, so I'd like to invite Dr. Nupur Patnaik. She is also a teacher sociology at the Koraput Central University. She will give the final formal vote of thanks. Over to Dr. Patnaik.
Thank you, Dr. Samuel. On behalf of all the participants and organizer of World Human Sciences and Management Conference, I express my deep sense of gratitude to Professor David Hirsh for being with us and enlightened us on sociology and anti-Semitism. Again, thank you so much to Professor Hirsh for accepting our invitation from all your busy schedule and joined us in this global digital platform all the way from London. And we are really thankful and grateful to you for your precious time. In this World Human Sciences and Management Conference, agnotological context, disciplinary practices of social science and policy frames, I would like to thank the patrons of the conference, Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director of IIM Sambalpur, and Professor I. Ramabrahma, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Central University of Odisha, Koraput, for the indispensable support for organizing this type of global program. And also, I would like to thank all the faculty members of these institutions for their valuable insights. I would like to thank the conveners of the conference, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, the futurist Professor Charudutta Panigrahi for the valuable support, the core member of the conference, Professor Sarath Kumar Palita, Professor and Dean, the Central University of Odisha, Koraput, who has always been encouraging us from the beginning. Thank you so much, Professor Palita, to be here with us. I would also like to thank all the technical supporters and coordinators who tirelessly supported us, Mr. Subham Das, Mr. Kamal Prasad Mohanty, Ghansham Giri, Chinmay Kumar Sahu, Anirudh Jena from Hyderabad University, Ms. Priyanka Das, and Rudra Narayan Das. Special thanks to Dr. Subhash Chandra Barik, Dr. Priyadarshi Kar, Dr. Shama Prasad Mishra, and students, researchers, teachers, professors, and academics from IIM Sambalpur, Koraput Central University, Ravenshaw University, Cuttack, and all the institutions, those who have joined and connected with us in this global digital platform by the Zoom meeting, Facebook, and the YouTube. Last but not the least, the important person who gathered us all together in this global digital platform, Dr. Bikram Kesari Jena, Director of Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Bhubaneswar. We are thankful and grateful to all the participants who have come here all the way. Thank you so much. Thank you.